Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, the show where we explore the link between creativity and mental illness. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Walt Whitman. He's a poet who really, turned American literature on its head.
Yeah, definitely. And he was kind of a rock star even back in the 19th century, like super aware of his image, you know?
Right, right. He was a master of, self-promotion. Some critics even think he, used this to sort of control how people saw his work.
Yeah.
Especially the stuff that was, a little edgy for the time.
Oh, totally. Like he was pushing boundaries for sure. And people definitely had opinions about it, especially his exploration of sexuality and the body. That was pretty controversial back then.
Yeah, definitely not your typical poetry subjects at the time.
No, not at all. And, it's interesting how this ties into the whole mad genius thing, right? Like, did those maybe more unconventional parts of his personality actually influence his art?
It's like the big question, right? Nature versus nurture. Was he just born with this unique vision, or did his maybe his struggles or whatever you want to call them actually contribute to his creativity?
Yeah, exactly. It's a tough one to answer. We've got his poems, his biographies, all this critical analysis of his work, but we can't really get inside his head, right?
Right. We're just piecing together the puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. But that's what makes it so interesting, right? Trying to figure out what made him tick. We're not trying to diagnose him or anything, but it's fascinating to consider how his life experiences might have shaped his art.
Totally. And it's not just about Whitman, right?
Yeah.
It's this bigger question about creativity and mental illness. Is there really a connection?
Yeah.
Or is it just something we project onto certain artists?
Yeah, it's a debate that's been going on for centuries. Some people think that certain mental health conditions, maybe bipolar disorder, can actually lead to these periods of intense creativity and inspiration. They point to folks like Van Gogh or Sylvia Plath. Their art seems so intertwined with their struggles, you know?
Right. But isn't there a danger in romanticizing mental illness too? I mean, these conditions can be super tough to deal with,
Yeah.
We don't want to glamorize suffering or anything.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really important point. We definitely don't want to trivialize mental illness. It's about being sensitive and acknowledging the complexities. For Whitman, it's not about, putting him on the therapist's couch. It's more about looking at his work within the context of this larger conversation about creativity and, mental health.
So how do we actually do that? How do we apply this mad genius lens to Whitman without falling into those traps we were just talking about?
I think the key is nuance, right? We got to dig deep into his poetry, look for recurring themes, his language, the imagery he uses, see if there are any clues that might give us a glimpse into his inner world.
His fascination with death, that comes up a lot in his work. Some critics see that as a sign of inner turmoil, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's also, a pretty universal theme.
Yeah.
Artists have been exploring that forever.
Exactly. It's about finding those subtle hints,
Yeah.
and remembering that there are no easy answers. It's all very complex.
Okay, so we're not trying to play armchair psychologist here. We're trying to see how his life experiences might have shaped his art. But where do we even start?
Well, I think a good place to start is with his early life and career. Before he became Walt Whitman the poet, he was a journalist, worked for a bunch of different newspapers in New York.
Huh. Interesting. So he was already a skilled writer before he started writing poetry.
Oh, absolutely. And that journalistic background definitely influenced his style. His use of detail, his focus on capturing the everyday lives of people.
Right. It's he was always interested in the human experience, even before he became a poet.
Totally. And you can see those early influences in his poetry for sure. His use of free verse, his unconventional subject matter, his focus on democracy and the common man. It all ties back to his experiences as a journalist.
Okay, so let's talk about his poetry then. What are some of the key elements of his style? What makes Whitman Whitman?
Well, for starters, there's the free verse thing. He completely threw out the traditional rule book of poetry. Forget rhyme schemes and meter. Whitman was all about capturing the natural rhythms of speech.
Right. It's he wanted his poetry to sound like real people talking, not stuffy or formal.
Exactly. He wanted his poetry to be accessible, to speak to everyone, not just the literary elite.
And then there's his subject matter, right? He wasn't afraid to tackle some pretty taboo topics, especially for the time.
Oh, yeah, definitely. He was all about celebrating the body, the senses, sexuality, and he was writing about these things in a way that was completely unheard of in American poetry at the time.
And that's what made him so controversial, right? He was pushing boundaries, challenging norms, and, well, a lot of people weren't ready for it.
Yeah, he definitely ruffled some feathers, but that's also what makes his work so important. He helped to pave the way for a more open, more honest, more inclusive kind of literature.
Okay, so we've got his unconventional style, his controversial subject matter.
Mhm.
What else is there?
Well, there's also this sense of expansiveness in his work. Like he's always trying to encompass everything to capture the totality of human experience.
Right, right. Like those long lists he uses, those catalogs of images and sensations. It's almost like he's trying to overwhelm you with like the sheer abundance of life.
Exactly. He's trying to make you feel everything, see everything, experience everything all at once. It's pretty intense, but it's also like incredibly powerful.
And, it's interesting how this all ties back to his personality, right? His need for connection, his attraction to younger men, all that stuff. It all seems to feed into this sense of like wanting to embrace everything, to connect with everyone.
Yeah, definitely. It's like he saw the world as this vast, interconnected web, and he wanted his poetry to reflect that.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about his style, his subject matter, his personality. But what about the actual content of his poems? Like, what was he trying to say?
Well, at its core, I think Whitman's poetry is a celebration of America. He believed in the promise of democracy, in the power of the individual, and the beauty of diversity, and he wanted to capture all of that in his work.
So he was like a patriotic poet,
Mm,
but like a very unconventional one.
exactly. He was patriotic in his own way. He loved America, but he wasn't afraid to criticize it either. He saw its flaws, its injustices, and he wasn't afraid to call them out.
Right, right. It's like he was trying to hold up a mirror to America and show it both its beauty and its ugliness.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. He wanted America to live up to its ideals, to be a truly inclusive and democratic society. And he used his poetry to push it in that direction.
So we've got this poet who's pushing boundaries, challenging norms, celebrating America, but also criticizing it. It sounds like he was a pretty complex dude.
Oh, absolutely. Whitman was full of contradictions, and that's what makes him so fascinating, right? He defies easy categorization.
Totally. So where do we go from here? Like, how do we start to make sense of this complex, contradictory, brilliant, and, well, maybe a little bit mad poet?
Well, I think the best way to understand Whitman is to really dive into his work, to read his poems, to grapple with his ideas, to feel the power of his language.
Right, right. Get lost in the word.
Exactly, because that's where the real magic lies, in the poetry itself.
Okay, so we've been talking about like Whitman's life and the whole mad genius thing, but I think it's time we actually get to the words themselves. Like his poetry, it's just so bold the way he throws out all the rules and embraces this like chaotic, almost overwhelming style.
That's the thing about free verse, right? It's like he's trying to like cram the entire human experience into every single line. The good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly. It's all there.
Yeah, and it's a lot to take in sometimes.
Yeah.
You always need a minute to like catch your breath after reading one of his long lines. Those lists he uses too, those catalogs of images and sensations, it's like sensory overload.
Totally. He's just bombarding you with details, like pulling you right into his world, Like take those lines from Song of Myself, The Blab of the Pave, Tires of Carts, Slough of Boot Soles, Talk of the Promenaders. It's like he's painting a picture with sounds, with textures, with movement. It's so vivid, right? And it's not just the sensory stuff, it's the emotions too. There's this raw, almost like visceral quality to his writing, like he's pouring his whole heart and soul onto the page.
Oh, absolutely. He was a master at capturing those raw emotions, his own, and like the emotions of the people around him. Like think about his Civil War poems, like Drum Taps. He doesn't shy away from like the brutality of it all, the suffering, but he also finds these moments of tenderness, of compassion, even in the midst of all that chaos.
Yeah, it's that mix of darkness and light that I find so compelling. It's like he's saying, yeah, life is messy and painful and full of contradictions, but it's also beautiful and powerful and worth celebrating.
Exactly. And, some people might argue that it's precisely that ability to embrace those contradictions, to go to those dark places, that makes Whitman's work so groundbreaking.
It's like he's not afraid to show us the shadow self, the parts of ourselves we usually try to hide. He's laying it all bare, no filter. And in doing so, he's like challenging our whole idea of what poetry is supposed to be, what art is supposed to be.
Right, right. It's like he's saying, this is life, deal with it. And it makes you wonder, could he have done that? Could he have broken all those barriers without, like, his own personal struggles?
It's an interesting question, right? Like, Did those struggles, those unconventional desires, maybe even his mental health, did those things actually give him a different perspective, a unique way of seeing the world?
It's like that double-edged sword we keep talking about.
Ugh.
The potential for, like, brilliance, but also the potential for suffering.
And with Whitman, you can see that tension playing out in his life and in his poetry. He was constantly pushing boundaries, challenging conventions, expressing his truth, even when it meant, like, facing rejection and criticism.
He was a true rebel, a revolutionary in life and in art. But, even rebels need support. They need validation. So what was the reaction to Whitman's work? Was he, like, instantly embraced by the literary world?
Oh, gosh, no, not even close. The reactions to Leaves of Grass were, well, they were all over the place. Some people, like Emerson at first, were blown away by it. They saw Whitman as a visionary, a poet who was like single-handedly reinventing American literature.
But then there were the others, right? The ones who were just, like, totally scandalized by his work.
Oh yeah, there were plenty of those. They thought he was obscene, immoral, dangerous, you name it. They couldn't handle his frankness about sex, his celebration of the body, his embrace of everything that was considered taboo back then.
It's amazing, right, how this brilliant mind, this powerful voice, could elicit such extreme reactions. Like he was holding up a mirror to society, and some people just couldn't handle what they saw.
And you know what's really interesting? He didn't back down, not one bit. He knew how to get people talking, how to generate publicity, and he used that to defend his work, his vision, his right to express himself freely.
He was like a master of self-promotion. But it wasn't just about ego, right? It was about something bigger than that.
He saw himself as like a champion of the common man, a voice for the voiceless. And he was willing to fight for that, even if it meant alienating some powerful people in the literary world.
So we've got this, like, unbelievably complex figure. A rebel, a visionary, a master of self-promotion, a champion of the underdog. That's a lot to unpack.
And as we delve deeper into his work, we'll start to see how all those pieces fit together, how his contradictions, his struggles, his triumphs all come together to create this body of work that is both challenging and inspiring, deeply personal and universally resonant.
It's funny, as we've been talking about Whitman, I keep thinking about that idea that he, like, incarnated his nation. Like, he believed the poet was this voice for the people, reflecting all their hopes and fears and dreams.
Right. Yeah, that was huge for Whitman. He saw himself as like a representative of the American spirit, a bard singing the song of democracy and the common man.
And that comes through in his language, too, right? It's so accessible, so direct, like he's speaking directly to the everyday experiences of ordinary people.
Exactly. He didn't shy away from slang or colloquialisms, even vulgarity sometimes.
Yeah.
Anything to connect with his audience, you know? He wanted his poetry to be felt, experienced, not just like analyzed under a microscope.
There's this real rawness to it. Captivating, also kind of unsettling sometimes. Like, he's not just writing about life, he's living it, bleeding it onto the page.
And that brings us back to that link between his life and his art. You know, how his personal struggles, his unconventional desires, maybe even his mental health, how all of that might have shaped his creative vision.
It's like we're trying to trace those threads,
Yeah.
See where the personal and the universal meet in his poetry.
And one of the most striking examples of that is his exploration of sexuality. In poems like Children of Adam and Calamus, he celebrates the body, the erotic, the sensual, and he did it in a way that was really shocking for his time.
He was risking everything, really. Challenging social norms, pushing boundaries, just to express his truth. And by doing that, he opened up all these possibilities for poetry, for art, even for how we understand ourselves.
It's that boldness, that refusal to shy away from the taboo, that makes Whitman such a crucial figure in American literature. He basically gave permission to future generations of poets and writers to explore those themes with more honesty, more freedom.
It makes you wonder, though, would he have been able to do that? To break down those barriers without those struggles, those unique experiences?
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's a fascinating question, right? Did those potential mental health challenges contribute to his sensitivity, his empathy, his ability to see the world in such a different way?
It's possible, right? That those struggles, those experiences of being an outsider, gave him a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, a more compassionate view of the world.
And maybe that's why his work still resonates with us today. He connects with readers on this gut level, speaks to our own hidden desires, our fears, our longing for connection, all those things we all share, you know?
Yeah, there's something timeless about his work, something that transcends time and place. It's like he reminds us that we're all connected, part of something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. And he encourages us to embrace our individuality, our own unique perspective, even if it doesn't fit in with what society expects.
Be bold, be fearless, sing your own song, even if it sounds a little strange, a little unconventional, a little mad to the rest of the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Walt Whitman, we want to leave you with this. What does it mean to incarnate your own nation, your community, your own truth?
We encourage you to explore his poetry for yourself. Find what speaks to you, what resonates with your own experiences, your own journey.
And remember, even when things are tough, even in the darkest moments, there's always beauty to be found. Always hope. Always a song waiting to be sung.
Thanks for joining us on the Mad Genius Thesis. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep those creative sparks flying.